You've been a busy guy at this conference. You've made a number of presentations, so we're hoping to touch on a few issues. One of the programs that you participated in focused on the need for libraries to embrace alternate avenues of discovery. What does that mean exactly?
It's a good question, because I don't think we had any, we didn't actually have any firm answers. I think we were asking a lot of questions, but the idea is that our users are starting with Google. They're starting with Google Scholar. They are unfortunately starting with things like Sci-Hub sometimes. They are maybe starting with discovery services, but even when they're starting with discovery services, they are not necessarily getting at all the library content that we want them to. So the idea behind the panel was to think about whether there are ways to sort of expand what we were thinking about as the discovery ecosystem, right? That we want people to use Google because that's where they're starting, but when they use it, we want them to get to library content or at least scholarly content. When they use a discovery service, we want them to get to high quality content. When they use a discovery service, we want them to have a good experience and come back. And I think so. I think the idea behind that panel and where we ended up is we need to make each of these things better, right? We need to make the experience of searching Google or Google Scholar work better for a user who wants to get to library content. So that they find the resources we're providing. We want somebody who starts in Google to end up in library content and not go back to Google and start again, so a seamless process. But we also want somebody who wants to use a specialized tool to be able to do that in a meaningful way as well. So I think the really alternative avenues of discovery means embracing all of those things and recognizing that our users are, whether we want them to or not, going to be using things like Google and Google Scholar and making those work as best as possible.
So, and one of the key things that we're looking at is making sure they get the quality material. That's what I'm hearing.
Right, that's right, yeah.
Well, building on that, Michael, how can the librarians enhance their discovery services to compete with other tools, while at the same time exploring the potential of these tools to give the user the broadest range of discovery?
I think so. One way of thinking about enhancing the tools is recognizing that we've created these discovery tools to compete with Google. They're not competing with Google, and maybe backing off from that a bit, right? So we certainly want the student who comes to Primo or EDS or Summon to do a search and find journal articles and find books. Right? That's great, and when it works, but we also want those to work for the student who maybe wants to do something a little bit more sophisticated but doesn't quite know where to begin, right? So they don't know where to go for a subject-specific database because they don't know what that subject-specific database is, but if they start with the discovery service and find have better options for finding content they need. And so that's one way of thinking, but another way of thinking of enhancing discovery services is, I always use the example of primary source content, right? So these great packages of content we have from Redex and Adam Matthew and so on, that stuff gets buried, as it probably should, in the discovery systems as they are now, but it would be great if there were sort of context-aware searching that showed that somebody wanted to find primary source content versus secondary source content and then pulled all that together. Or maybe that allowed them to sort of limit the search just to primary source content, but in a really meaningful way. So I think those are some ways to think about it.
Okay.
Is there a role for publishers and database providers in improving this situation and enhancing the scenario?
Yeah, I think there's a role for all of us. I mean, publishers, and going back to the general sort of discovery ecosystem idea, beyond the discovery system, or the Discovery Service. One idea is that really publishers should be. We know that most referrals to publisher content come from Google and Google Scholar. Wouldn't it be cool if the publishers worked either with another service or with each other to make it so that when somebody ends up on the publisher content, they get to the library content, which then sends them back to a different publisher's content, and so on, right? So that there's a seamless process, a landing page of some sort, right? And whether that's provided by a third party or by a publisher, doesn't really matter to me. And the other thing that I think publishers could help us with is if you, for instance, did a search of Google, ended up on a page for a book title, an ebook title, it then somehow sent you to the library catalog where you discover we have the print title. So I think there are ways that in an ideal world they would all link together.
It sounds like you're talking about integration of some
Yeah,
sort.
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well, you recently participated in a session that discussed the recent study focusing on the expanding availability of journal articles in various open access forums.
Yeah.
What findings did you and the rest of the panel share with the audience? And I have one other little question. What about the issue of the article of record?
Sure, yeah. So I'm really excited about that study. This is something I'm doing with John McDonald from USC and Jason Price from Skelk, and we've done a number of things around discovery over the years. And this one, it's not about open access content; it's about freely available, right? So from a user perspective, they don't care. They probably don't even know, and yet they should care, and they should know, or maybe they don't need to know, but they certainly need to care. We were looking at the availability of open access content via Google and Google Scholar,
Right.
the availability of rogue content through ResearchGate and academia.edu, where it's archived by the author. We know from a lot of reports from publishers that a lot of the articles in ResearchGate and academia.edu are not versions that should be shared, and so that's why we're referring to that as rogue. And then we looked at Sci-Hub as well, which we were referring to as pirated because Sci-Hub it's pirated. A couple of results. One, around 55% of the articles that we looked for were available in an open access or rogue version. Through Google Scholar, or ResearchGate. 87% of the articles we looked for were available in Sci-Hub, which is pretty shocking,
Yes, it is.
right?
Wow.
So whether we want to deal with Sci-Hub or not, we have to. It is, and by deal with it, I don't mean embrace it, actually, but I mean it's something we have to face. Some other things that were related to Sci-Hub, there was a survey of 11,000 researchers in science earlier this year. 88% of them said they don't care whether it's pirated or not. Right? They're willing to download pirated content.
Wow.
About 40% of respondents to that survey said that the reason that they use Sci-Hub is either because it's more convenient than the library. That's 17% of them, I think. And then 23% said because basically they want to stick it to the publisher, right? Which isn't quite what the phrasing was, but essentially we don't like the profits of publishers, so that's why we're going to do this. So what I read into that is that, and then 50% said because they don't have access to the article otherwise. But that 40% is essentially saying, I do have access to the article and I'm choosing to use Sci-Hub. And that should be disturbing to us too. So what do we do about that? I don't know, but
You mentioned, that some of this was the usability is a lot easier with these pirated
That's right.
articles.
That's right.
And that's something that publishers have to address.
That's absolutely, and publishers and libraries and our discovery vendors, right? So some of it is as basic as we make people click 2 or 3 times to get to it, and you only have to click once in Sci-Hub. Some of it is the fact that we are forcing people to authenticate, and we're forcing them to authenticate because we're paying lots of money and we have licenses and so on, and that's something that we're doing in conjunction with publishers and discovery vendors, and we need to figure out how to make that whole process easier.
And the whole copying limitations
Yeah,
too.
that's right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and so some of it is recognizing that there's a need of some sort in the current system to have a some kind of firewall, some kind of authentication process, but making that process as easy as most other things on the web, where you sign in and then you're in, right? If you could sign in once and get to all articles with one click, that would probably solve some of the Sci-Hub problem. So it's a scary issue, interesting issue, and probably one that is going to force a lot of change on all of us.
It sounds like breaking down barriers to access is one of the things that librarians could do.
Right.
But if you think in terms of the overall open access as a ecosystem for open access and freely available materials, what else can librarians do to make this work more efficiently and better?
It's a good question. I think one way to make it better, or one thing we can do is educate users. That's probably a relatively small thing that we can do that has a relatively small impact. I think figuring out how to make the legitimate freely available content as readily available as possible. A lot of it's available through Google and Google Scholar. My assumption, we did a little bit of preliminary testing of this, but we didn't do enough. But our assumption is that it's not actually as available through our discovery systems as it should be. So just for example, if you're using the link resolver or your knowledge base, if you set up your knowledge base, you don't subscribe to a journal, you tell your knowledge base if you don't subscribe to that journal. User comes into the discovery system, it's a hybrid journal. There are open access to articles in that journal, but they're all unavailable because we've configured our system to not recognize that journal actually has some open access articles. So article level versus journal level in the knowledge base would solve that small problem. But I think sort of, a lot of what I was involved in at this conference was asking questions and I think pointing out that there were some issues and not necessarily having answers. And this is one where I don't know that I have a solution.
Well, we're probably at that stage where that's where we are. We're trying to figure it out.
Exactly.
And it's more than just librarians and libraries, it's publishers, it's database providers, it's all of us have to work together to figure this stuff out.
Yeah, definitely.
One other thing about the open access materials, it seems to us that open access in some ways threatens the library's role in funding collection development. Is that true, or are we missing something?
Yeah, I think it does. But that maybe isn't a problem, right? So it's a problem if you need to continue funding collection development. It's certainly a problem if the open access, if the article processing charge funds get the subscription funds get converted entirely to article processing charges, and then the entire collection budget goes away. But if the portion of the budget that is covering special collections and monographs and everything else continues to exist, we don't need that subscription portion, so maybe that's not a problem. But I think what is more likely to happen, and what I hope happens, is that we will have a gradual transition to some sort of combination. Actually, I don't hope for the some sort of. I'll start over. I think what's more likely to happen is that we'll have a gradual transition, and that we will have what we're seeing now. We're paying APCs. Our subscription costs haven't gone down. We're getting those APCs from a variety of different places. Some of it's coming from the library collections budget, some of it's coming maybe from the Office of Research, some of it's coming from the Provost's office, some of it's coming from grants, some of it's coming from departments, and so on. If that transition keeps happening in that way, there's a larger pool of money built up, and in the ideal world, there's a complete transition, right? And everything we're spending on subscriptions goes to cover APCs. I don't actually believe that will happen, right? I think it's going to be a mix of models. But imagining that does happen, some of that money then goes to cover APCs. Maybe more of it goes to cover things like special collections and archives, and maybe more library services rather than buying collections. And certainly, in an open environment where content is freely available on the web, those services around providing access become more and more and more important, right? So paying for both services and systems to aid discovery and access become really valuable. So in my ideal world, but the money is actually still there in the library budget, probably a smaller budget because it doesn't need to be as large. But we're redeploying it into special collections and into services to provide access.
You know, these transformations, though, can actually happen very quickly.
Yep.
We've seen an absolute transformation in interlibrary loan through Get It Now.
Yep.
And our cost shot through the roof in a matter of a single year, 5 or 6 times what we initially budgeted. So it can jump like that.
It can. So why I think it wouldn't happen as quickly with open access is that there are too many things that have to happen, right? So if you take the relatively small, very ambitious Scope 3 project, which was to flip a small number of journals in physics. It succeeded, but what they discovered was figuring out the cost for each library was really complicated. And there were, if there were 1,000 participants, there were probably 1,000 different prices. And if you then multiply that across every journal and every discipline, and recognize that some libraries have access to that journal through a package, some are buying directly, right? I think just the sheer complexity of calculating how to make that change happen means that it can't happen as quickly as something like a transition away from interlibrary loan. I think the other factor that's tremendously important to recognize is that there's a great disparity in terms of research output versus subscription, and that you have a University of Denver is a really good example of a place where if we had a complete transition to APC funded open access today, I would be thrilled because we are a relatively well-funded institution for our size and for our research output, and so we pay more in subscriptions than we ever would in APC charges based on our current research output.
I see what you're saying.
Meanwhile, Caltech is a really great example of the opposite. They have a slightly smaller subscription budget than the University of Denver, but their research output is, it's 20 or 50 or 100 times as large. So they would pay much more, and you have that across the system. So I think the transition has to take a long time because of all those
see what you're saying.
things.
And in that model, it sounds like the libraries are paying the APC charges.
Yeah, right, or the library budget through the provost through the library budget, of course. But even if you look at that University of Denver and Caltech example, even if you factor in funding from grants for some portion of those articles, and factor in the fact that there are multi-author articles and some of those APCs would be funded through other institutions, even then that Caltech still ends up paying more for APCs and University of Denver less.
So you see the library as having a responsibility for paying these APCs?
Not necessarily for paying the APC. So what I see happening is, as the system changes, the money has to come from somewhere, and some of it will come from grants, some of it will come from department funds. But if it were to happen on a really large scale, at some point the university would say, well, we're spending less money now. We don't need to spend the money on subscriptions, so it will go to APCs. But again, I don't see that happening in any easy or meaningful way, because it has to get more expensive before it becomes less expensive, as we're paying for both APCs and subscriptions.
Well, this morning we were treated to a wonderful debate in the annual Hyde Park debate. The proposition this year was, resolved, the APC-funded open access is antithetical to the values of librarianship. Which side, for the audience, which side of the question did you argue, and how did you feel about this, the debate as it unfolded?
I argued against the proposition, right? So I argued that APC-funded open access was in line with the values of librarianship. I actually argued probably a stronger version of that than I truly believe. So I believe that APC-funded open access does line up with the values of librarianship. I have great concerns about APC-funded open access for a number of reasons, and actually my biggest concern with APC-funded open access, besides the fact that the transition will be difficult and the costs don't quite line up, is that it imposes a barrier for publication, right? So for people who don't have that funding, whether it's because they're at an institution with no funding or don't have grant funding or are in a discipline that doesn't have grant funding, there's a barrier. So that's a concern. That said, I argued that APC-funded open access provides greater access to information. It provides a much wider range of information with no barriers. It solves some of those issues we were talking about earlier in terms of discovery. If everything is freely available, then you don't have to worry about the fact that it's harder to find things on library systems than on Google or Sci-Hub. So it solves a lot of problems. I think those things are firmly in line with the values of librarianship. So that was my argument. I did acknowledge the problems with APC funding. I chose sort of as a strategy not to emphasize those as strongly as I could. The audience sided with me, but the more people were swayed by my competitor than by my argument.
To me, as I was listening, I kept thinking, this is really just a funding issue. This is not really about a core value or anything else. This is about who's paying for what.
Yeah.
Is that? I
think that's true. Yeah. I mean, and so my feeling about the proposition, or the resolution, I should say, was, I believe that in an ideal world, everything should be open. Open access is fundamentally, I think, fundamentally in line with library values. how you pay for it is the issue. In an ideal world where we had enough money to pay for it and could make everything open, we would have done a good thing. And so, yeah, I think it is fundamentally about where the money comes from, whether there's enough money in the system,
Right.
whether you create haves and have-nots in a different way than you do with subscriptions. And so I felt it was, to me, no question about whether it's in line, whether it lines up with the values of librarianship. The question to me was more about whether it causes other problems, right, right, than the ones we have now.
Yeah, there are always unintended
Yeah.
consequences
Right.
to all of this.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have was there something else you wanted to?
No.
Okay. We usually like to end up, just to make sure we don't miss anything,
Okay.
is to kind of put you in our chair.
Okay.
If you were sitting where Jack is sitting, what question would you ask yourself? Is there anything
So-
that we've missed that,
Yeah.
that we
No.
should
Well,
be
I guess
talking about?
I guess what I'll say is that it's not a question, but it's an observation that my three topics really worked well together, and that was not by design. I was asked to do the debate. We, in planning the debate, sort of hammered out the topic. My two other presentations were independent of one another. They weren't intended to be
Right.
the same thing, but they actually ended up all being roughly about this same issue, right? It's about discovery and availability of scholarly content on the web, and where the library fits into that open and quasi-open world. And so it was interesting to me to be looking at each of those three issues that are related to each other, but from a slightly different lens in each of the presentations.
Well, they're all part of that ecosystem that we're trying
Yeah.
to deal with. I
That's
like
right.
that term,
Yeah.
ecosystem,
Yeah.
because it really, it's holistic.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
not just separate problems. They
Right.
kind of meld and
Yeah.
merge together.
Yeah,
So.
and I think the thing about that's really important when you think about that ecosystem is that it's a system that we and our vendors and our publishers and of course our users all play in together, and we should all be concerned about the future of that system and how we relate to each other in that system.
Well, and that's one of the purposes of this conference, is to
Yes,
enable us
that's
all
right.
to sit
That's
down
right.
together and
Yeah.
try to hammer these things out.
Right, and that's one of the things I've always loved about this
Yeah.
conference.
Michael, thank you so
Yeah.
much
Thank
for
you so
coming by.
much.
We really
Yes.
appreciate talking
Thank
to
you.
you.
Enjoyed it.
Enjoyed it.
And
Yeah.
as always, when we do these sessions with folks, I learn so much. It's just
That's
fantastic.
absolutely.